Hey, welcome if you're joining for our Ohio River discussion. Hello, Debbie.
Hello.
Folks are arriving. Welcome. I see a caller. Lisa, is that you?
It might be me. I'm Angela Manuzak.
Hello, Angela. Welcome.
Hello.
Welcome all callers. I know one of our panelists, I believe, will be calling in, so that's why I asked. So thank you for identifying yourself.
You're welcome. Will there be slides or any visuals?
There's one slide, and I will describe what's on that slide. So aside from some welcome slides, some housekeeping slides, and sort of lay of the land slides, there's sort of one thematic slide which I will describe. So for those on the phone, you will get 99% of what we're talking about, and hopefully by my description, that will fill in any questions about the visuals. So you are in luck.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you for asking. Great question. And yeah, it's a few minutes before noon, so folks are still queuing up. So welcome. We'll get going in a little bit. My name is Jordan Lebetkin with the National Wildlife Federation. And on behalf of all our partners here today, including Ohio University, Ohio River Basin Alliance, or SANCO, and many others, thanks for tuning in. I think we have a nice program, and we look forward to chatting with you all. So for folks who are on the webinar, you should be seeing a welcome slide that introduces this to the Ohio River Restoration discussion. If you're not seeing that, let me know. Hi, John, welcome. Thanks for joining. Folks are still queuing up. We have a few minutes. So hopefully it's a nice shiny day where you are. We have sun today, which is beautiful. So we'll take it after 3 months of gray. So the last week actually has been quite beautiful. So hopefully it is wherever you are dialing in from or go-to meeting in from. Welcome. And again, it's still a few minutes before noon. We'll get started maybe a minute or so after. We'll let folks get on the line. We have a nice RSVP list. Want to make sure everyone has a chance to get in for today's discussion. And
Hey,
for
Jordan,
folks,
I wanted to check that
Sorry, go
my mic
ahead.
is working.
Perfect.
I just wanted to.
I can hear
Cool,
you.
thanks.
Great.
Hi, this is Lisa.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks for dialing in.
Jordan. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I know caller 2 is Lisa. So all of our panelists are here. Still a few minutes before noon. We're really excited about today's discussion. You can see on this welcome slide here, we should all be used to the lay of the land in a virtual sort of setting, but if you can mute your line when you're not talking, that'll be great. Sometimes keeping your camera off will save bandwidth. Of course, if you're asking a question, we'd love to see who you are, so please feel free to turn your camera on. Again, we'll be getting started in a few minutes. We're looking forward to the conversation today about a really exciting opportunity for the Ohio River, for the tributaries and communities all around this 14-state region. So great conversation, great panelists, and really excited to be here. So we'll get started in a few minutes. Thanks for joining us. And I'll remind folks, this will be a discussion. We'll be happy to take your questions. This will be the first of a few times I'll say this, but if you have questions, please feel free to ask. Don't be shy. You can raise your hand in the lower left-hand corner. You can put a question in the chat, or feel free to come off mute and ask your question.
Jordan, I just want, while we're waiting a couple minutes, if you want to use the chat to introduce yourself, put your name and organization,
Sure.
any other contact information you want, and share that with the group. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to put my information in the chat. I encourage others to do that as well. And make sure I didn't botch my email. So there I am, National Wildlife Federation. There's my email. I'll put that at the end of this conversation as well. So introduce yourself, name, organization, anything else you'd like to say. I have it at noon. Right now, we'll give maybe 1 or 2 more minutes, but we do have a lot of great content to get to. So we're going to start in about a minute or two. As I see folks are still queuing up. Great. Thanks, folks, for putting your name, organization in the chat. Keep it coming. We'd like to know who you are. And we won't be strangers either. You'll be hearing from us in a few minutes. So all right, I have 12:01 and 30 seconds. We're going to start with some housekeeping, and then we'll get right to it. Again, my name is Jordan Lubetkin. I'm with the National Wildlife Federation, and excited to be joining you all here today. We have a lot to discuss. Glad you're sharing your afternoon with us. And I think we're going to just start going through the housekeeping. I know some folks are still arriving, but I want to keep this on time, and I want to respect your time. This is slated for 12 to 1, and we have a program that we'll be talking with you, and happy to take your questions. So here we go. Just quickly, some quick housekeeping. Please introduce yourself in the chat. If you have network connectivity issues, if you keep your camera off and keep it muted, that will probably help. You can use the chat function as people are doing to introduce themselves to help get questions out there. You can also take yourself off mute, and you can also use the lower left-hand icon with the hand function to raise your hand. All those are acceptable. And then Nick's also on the line from Orsenco. You see Nick's email there, ncallahan@orsenco.org. If you need any certificates signed, he can take care of that for you. There's who we are, but we're not going to dwell on that because we're going to do that now. And a quick reminder, we have a lot of great programs. Again, thanks to the Voinovich School, thanks to Orba, Orsenco, West Virginia Rivers, all the sponsors who put this program on every month. You can see there on March 8th, 12 noon, a really great program with student voices. So I hope you all can attend that as well. And lastly, Jen Bowman, who oversees this, if you have, if you want to offer an idea on a topic, please email Jen, and her contact information is on that slide. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we're going to get going. Let's get it going. So welcome. My name is Jordan Lubetkin. I'm with the National Wildlife Federation. I oversee our Ohio River Restoration Program, and on behalf of all our partners here today who will be introducing themselves in about a minute, I want to sort of thank you for coming and sharing your time. If you're here to learn about the Ohio River, if you're here to learn about Ohio River restoration, if you're here to learn about a really exciting once-in-a-generation opportunity to stand up for this resource, you're in the right place. You know, oftentimes people ask the environment, you know, how does that stack up in terms of national priorities? I would say there is not a single issue in this country that is more important than the fact that this year, 2023, there are still millions of people in the United States and the Ohio River Basin that do not have access to clean, safe, and affordable water. They don't have access to clean sanitation services. They're not able to afford these essential basic services. So what we're here to do is talk about an opportunity to change that. And we'll get to that in about 1 minute here. So what we're here to do is 2 goals. We're going to fill you in on this restoration planning process. We're going to tell you about the opportunity at hand, and we're going to give you a forum to ask questions. I've already talked about the technology. You can take yourself off mute. You can raise your hand or put it in the chat. And we will encourage you throughout the presentation to please ask a question, or at the end, there'll be ample time for questions. With that, I'm going to let all the panelists introduce themselves. I'll call on folks, and then I'll give us some background information, and we're going to get right into it. So on my screen, John, why don't you go, and then Debbie. John.
Hi, everyone. I'm John Chuba. I'm an assistant professor at Virginia Tech in the Department of Biological Systems Engineering. I am currently one of the co-leads for the hydrology chapter for this Ohio River Basin Restoration Plan. And my research focuses on really water and sediment transport in rivers and streams. And so thinking about how that affects built infrastructure and also biota and water quality are some of my interests. And so, bringing that knowledge to this plan, I think will be helpful in bringing the scientific perspective on how water and sediment are going to affect our ecosystem.
Thanks, John. How about Debbie and then Sally?
Thanks, Jordan. Great to see everybody. I'm Debbie Phillips. I'm the CEO of Rural Action. We are located in southeastern Ohio in Athens County, and we engage in asset-based community development. So we are practitioners, and we have about 30 years track record working on acid mine drainage remediation in our region, in the coal-impacted region of Ohio. We also have programs in agriculture, and forestry, and other things that touch the landscape within the Ohio River Basin. I've been serving as the co-lead of the climate change chapter working on this plan because our organization believes that this region is tremendously important to the nation and the world in response to the climate crisis, and really just want to be supportive in efforts that are going to bring the information and the resources that are needed to be responsive. Glad to be here.
Thanks, Debbie. Sally, and then Lisa.
Hey, well, thank you, Jordan. And it's great to see a lot of friends. So that's really nice. My name is Sally Gutierrez, and I'm with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I'm out of the Office of Research and Development, out of the Water Research Laboratory there in Cincinnati. So I've been at this for a very long time, but I guess for me, I was very excited to, just hear about this effort to develop this restoration plan for the Ohio River Basin. And Jordan and I have been partners in the area of environmental justice. And so we are working on that aspect of it. And another very important aspect of it is the part of the plan that will address issues that affect tribal nations. And it's not just federally recognized tribes. We have many, many different forms of tribal related issues. You have some state recognized tribes. You have organizations that are also advocates for tribal needs. So we're trying to be very inclusive in that as we go forward. I'm a water person for many, many, many years, working in technology, working in resource protection, permitting, drinking water quality. So I bring kind of that technical aspect, but we're trying to really focus our attention on these issues of environmental justice and tribal issues in the basin. So thanks, Jordan.
Great, thanks, Sally. And Lisa, why don't you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Lisa Hollingsworth Segedy. I work for American Rivers, and today I'm coming to you from near Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And Jordan, if you want to, since I'm audio only, if you want to show the picture that I sent you a little bit earlier, I'm a aquatic habitat connectivity practitioner. Working through American Rivers, we are focused on eliminating obsolete dams and road stream crossings and restoring as much aquatic habitat connectivity as we can for multiple benefits, including, of course, benefits to species, but also climate resilience, flood risk reduction, public safety, improved recreation access. In some cases, the removal of obsolete dams can become a community revitalization effort associated with connecting the community to the rivers themselves. And I'm here to tell you, I work primarily in the headwaters of the Ohio River Basin. And if rivers were named according to hydrology, then the Ohio River would be called the Allegheny.
Thanks, Lisa. And we're looking at the wonderful picture. I think you're making us all jealous about where you are today. so thank you for that photo. So thank you, Lisa, John, Sally, and Debbie for introducing yourselves. I'm going to spend a little bit of time just to set the backstory here and remind folks why you're here. I'm going to share my screen. This will not be a technology heavy, excuse me. I need to. So Nick, if I could just have permission to share my slide, I think I'm being blocked. There we go. Okay, so bear with me and it should be coming up. So this is a slide maybe several of you have seen before. This is somewhat of an ubiquitous slide. When we talk about Ohio River restoration, we talk about the wonderful once in a generation opportunity we have before us. For folks who don't know or folks that do, it's a good reminder. Every year, the federal government invests millions and millions of dollars in restoring and protecting our nation's great waters, the Chesapeake Bay, the Florida Everglades, the Great Lakes, Puget Sound, the Gulf Coast, Long Island Sound. And so one of the things you'll see on that chart is there's a big zero by the Ohio River Basin. That is something we're looking to change. We would like to see the importance of Ohio River issues elevated. We'd like to see the federal government take a more intensive and robust interest in this region. And we're looking to change that under the leadership of the Ohio River Basin Alliance, one of the organizers of this discussion series. And essentially our task to do that is twofold. Number one, which has been referenced in this introductions, we need to write a compelling, bold, and visionary restoration plan for the region. And number two, we need to get Congress to fund it so it can be implemented. So what we're here to do is talk about where we are in that process, which is currently step one. We're crafting that bold visionary plan, and we'll talk a little bit more about that plan in a second. But I want to sort of emphasize why that's important. And I alluded to it at the outset of this program. You know, this basin, this region is incredibly wonderful and biodiverse. I mean, I work for the National Wildlife Federation. A lot of my career here over 18 years has been the Great Lakes side of things, and now I'm in the Ohio River side of things. And one of the things I've learned, partly through the discussion series and all the wonderful people I've met, some of them are on this webinar, is that this region is one of the most biodiverse, rich, wonderful regions, not just in the nation, but the entire world. And I think, unfortunately, that's, we're talking about biodiversity. We're talking about things that lead to great recreational opportunities in fishing and kayaking and hiking and camping. We're talking about drinking water for millions of people. We're talking about a wonderful place to live, to do business. And I think, unfortunately, like other parts of the country, there are serious, serious threats. And probably those are not unknown to folks on this call, but just so we all have a handle on it, we're talking about mining impacts from historic and legacy mining, from acid mine drainage. We're talking about loss of habitat. We're talking about inadequate wastewater infrastructure that leads to sewage contamination. We're talking about pollutants like toxic PFAS and other serious health-threatening pollutants that we need to address. We're talking about, I think Lisa mentioned it, altered habitat in terms of old unsafe dams that block fish passage and also are unsafe for boaters. So this region has a host of issues that are only being exacerbated by climate change, as Debbie mentioned. We have more intense flooding. We have more hard rain events in the spring and drought in the summer. And all these things are working in tandem to create problems, not just for fish and wildlife, but for people. And what we're looking to do is craft a plan to change that. And there is some urgency. The longer we take to address these, the more difficult and expensive these problems become. And we know this. So what we need to do is craft that compelling plan, deliver it to Congress, and then start working on it, start getting boots on the ground, start doing the things we need to do. And I think one of the things that's interesting about this plan, and Sally alluded to a little, and so did Debbie, is that, we are looking, yes, at ecological outcomes and goals, looking at ecological challenges to confront. We're also looking at the human impacts. What are those environmental injustices that have disproportionately hurt low-income people, rural people, minorities, indigenous people? We know that the people most impacted by pollution tend to be poor, they tend to be minority, and they tend to be indigenous. Well, how can we look to change that as we look to embark on cleaning up and restoring and protecting this great resource? Well, we're looking to do that. And it's really an exciting process. I think you can see, number one, I think folks have mentioned on this call, they are a lead or co-lead on various chapters or sections of the plan. There are 9 sections. We obviously couldn't get representation from all of the folks on today's call. That would be sort of an onerous panel to wrangle. But we do have representatives of several. I'm just going to list off the committees here. I wrote them down so I won't forget. We have toxic pollution, we have water infrastructure, we have non-point pollution, we have hydrology, habitat and species, invasive species, acid mine drainage, climate change, and environmental injustices. So 9 chapters, a lot of stuff in the plan. We're working on it now diligently. And so where are we? And we're going to get more into this as we go around the panelists here. But just to give you a sense of what we're trying to do in the timeline. We have this multi-stakeholder group that contains folks from academia, folks from NGOs, folks from state and federal agencies, from the private sector, from utilities. It's probably, I need to make a nod to Richard Harrison, director of Orsenco. It's their quarterly meeting now, but Richard is sort of the co-lead in this endeavor to do this planning process. And we have people from all different sectors who are using their knowledge and expertise to put forward the best product. We've held listening sessions to make sure that the clean water priorities for this 14-state region, because we're including not just the Ohio River, but we're including the tributaries, the wetlands, and the waters that feed it, that we have stakeholders from different sectors, from different geographies, and we also have input from the local communities, especially the communities that are most impacted by harm. Starting from last summer and still ongoing, we've held, I think, now 25 listening sessions. We have one scheduled tomorrow in Southern Ohio. We have one at the end of the month in Cairo, Illinois. We're getting one on the books in Cincinnati finally after some delay on my part. And so I just want to say, like, what we've been hearing in a nutshell are really inspiring, compelling stories to the people who are seeing these impacts. We're hearing about flooding in places like Wheeling and Huntington. We're hearing about toxic pollution and PFAS. And this area is pretty much ground zero for PFAS from folks in Marietta, Ohio, and other communities. We're hearing about the need for pollution prevention, not just restoration, but prevention. Let's prevent new harm from being done. We're hearing about some of the challenges in Kentucky for water affordability in Eastern Kentucky. Like, people can't pay for it. They have to upgrade their septic system. They just can't afford it. People still have straight pipes that go straight into the water source. So what we're trying to do is combine the expertise of that work group, that 150-ish member work group, with the real stories, the opinions, the experiences, and the lived experiences of people on the ground. And so those are ongoing. And what that's leading to is a bunch of information that we're trying to synthesize in a compelling way. The end audience for this is Congress. And what we need to do is galvanize the members of this region, the Ohio River Congressional Caucus, 14 states. This basin touches all or parts of 14 states. There's a lot of power in that delegation, and we need to make sure that we are putting together a product that captures not just the threats and solutions, but also captures the narrative that will resonate to both the people and communities and the lawmakers and elected officials that represent and live and work in this area. And I will say that one area about how this differentiates from maybe other initiatives is that this is very much a ground up level. This isn't a top down executive order. It's not something that was mandated. This is something that the region has been coming together for actually several years now under ORBA's Ohio River Basin Alliance leadership, to really put in place this widespread movement to make sure they were elevating Ohio River priorities to the national priority they should be. And I will say one other interesting thing we've both been hearing about and discussing that is somewhat different than other groups, other restoration initiatives, is that we're really hearing that if we're going to invest millions and eventually billions of dollars in this region to address these serious threats to our drinking water, to our communities, to our fish and wildlife, to our recreation, to our economy, we want to make sure that that money is going to communities and they can use it, that we are not just selecting community-based priorities, but we have the workers, we have the businesses that have the skill set, the job training, the workforce development, that they can take advantage of it, so that we are seeing environmental restoration and protection go hand in hand with community revitalization, with community revival, and with economic opportunity. So we're really excited to talk about where we are and some of the things that some of the groups are grappling with and some of the issues. And I'm going to introduce some of the panelists now, and they can talk a little bit about their section and what we're doing. And I'll remind folks, if you have a question about anything, please put it in the chat. Please raise your hand, and we'd be happy to take them as we go. We'll also have plenty of time for questions at the end. So with that, there's some table settings, some background, where we are, the opportunity ahead of us and before us, and we want to seize that opportunity. We want to seize the day for communities large and small, and we're excited to do that. So I'm going to hand it over to John, and he can talk a little bit about the hydrology chapter he's working on. John, go ahead.
Thanks, Jordan. Yeah, so for the hydrology chapter, and I guess all the chapters in general, it's about first trying to start in establishing what's the problem, what's the threat, what's the scale of the issue related to that topic area. In my area, it's hydrology. Then laying out some long-term goals that we'll be trying to achieve, and then some short and long-term actions that can achieve that. So as mentioned before, I'm co-leading this with Lisa. And so I'll talk a little bit about, the problem and how we're thinking about hydrology in this basin and some of our goals. And then Lisa will talk a little bit more about some on the ground actions that are happening. And so, as Jordan mentioned, this is a very, rich and diverse area for aquatic biota. That some of the oldest rivers in the world are in the Ohio River Basin. And so they've evolved there for a very long time under a very specific hydrologic regime, and that has changed in the last 200 years as Europeans have come in, and as we've continued to modify our landscapes to various degrees. And so what those species are used to are not what they're living in now, and so it's led to some species becoming extinct or being endangered or threatened, and also in some of the things that we've done has in some way undermined the ability for our hydrology to recharge groundwater and provide healthy, clean water for drinking water purposes, as well as we have increased flooding can undermine some of our infrastructure. So it's biota is important, but it's also there's a very important aspect for all of this in terms of thinking about human consequences. Some of the big things that have happened, we've had in those 200 years, we've had significant deforestation. Beavers have been decimated. Those used to be pretty good at slowing the flow on landscapes. We've drained lots of wetlands for agriculture, put in roadside and agricultural ditches and drain tiles. All these things are leading to a landscape that retains less water, puts more of it into stream flow channels, and so we're not recharging groundwater as effectively. It's going into channels. You're getting more extensive flooding, and you're getting more bank erosion. That's adding more sediment into stream channels. And then that sediment as well, we're not talking that much about, but sediment is also affecting biota. It's leading to higher levels of turbidity, which becomes more expensive for drinking water filtration, as well as, those are things that the Army Corps is dealing with when they have to dredge the main stem Ohio River for shipping. So all this stuff is connected between people and ecosystems. And so, some of the additional things that we're thinking about and concerned about are there's an extensive number of dams, I think over 25,000 dams. There's lots of levees. There are lots of road crossings, people putting in culverts between roads that may be improperly sized or not connected efficiently, so the fish and other species cannot go, from the downstream side to the upstream side, or vice versa, because there might be a step change in that level from the bed of the stream to that culvert. So what that does is creates barriers for some of these species to move through the system, and so that becomes more limited habitat for them as well. Lastly, I think thinking about some of the threats. I think the other thing that Debbie will talk a little bit more is climate change, and one of the big things to think about is that in this hydrology, the hydrologic regime that's happening, the precipitation is now being redistributed throughout the year. Even if you get the same amount, we can get much more in a very short time, and then a very long intervening time before the next storm. So in the same year, we can have extensive floods and crippling droughts. That is happening and is likely to continue to happen. And so in addition to all the things that have happened, just the direct modifications, we have climate change on top of that, exacerbating some of these issues. And as populations grow, we're looking for more water for irrigation, drinking water, and industrial use. Fracking is one thing that's also requires water use in the basin. So those are all the things we're trying to think about, and as we kind of think about how we can move forward, and what are some goals for the Ohio River Basin in terms of hydrology. And really what we're trying to do is restore some of the ecosystem function that was occurring prior to the European settlement. Now, we understand that we can't just turn back the clock and make the basin look like it did 200 years ago. That's not possible. The goal is try to restore some of that functioning that was happening, which includes intercepting more rainfall on the landscape and runoff, so that can be retained and better infiltrated, and that will help reduce, increase groundwater levels. It will also reduce downstream flooding and erosion, and having prolonged base flow of cooler, cleaner water during the dry weather, that's going to help biota as well. And so, the 5 long-term goals, what I'll end on is saying that, one, we're trying to restore a natural flow regime. We're trying to protect critical hydrologic source areas, where and ecosystems, where are the things that are, the best quality areas and the ones that are most important for encouraging more groundwater seepage into the landscape, building resilience for communities and ecosystems to both floods and droughts, with a need to continuously monitor the ecological health of the basin, and having science to help adapt that management moving forward. And then I think, lastly and I think the biggest challenge, or one of the big challenges, is synchronizing planning efforts across the basin in regional, state, and local plans. Maybe we'll get to this a little bit later today, but I think, making investments that target the collective good of the Ohio River Basin, when specific money is going to specific organizations, how do we understand where to put those things and make those changes? So with that, I'll pass it off to Lisa, within that context, to talk about some of the on the ground things that we're thinking about, and that she's doing at American Rivers.
Thanks, John. Lisa, go ahead.
Okay, so thank you. One of the things that John mentioned was restoring form and function to our rivers, which is certainly removing a dam is one of the fastest things that you can do to help kickstart that river or stream returning to its more normal form and function. We also do additional work in terms of stream bank stabilization. Areas like Pennsylvania that experienced a lot of clear cutting from about 1850 to about 1930. We have a lot of sediment issues in a lot of our streams, and that's something that we have to certainly look at as as we're removing barriers, just taking a barrier down doesn't necessarily do all the work that the habitat needs. So we look very closely at these streams and try to determine what do we need to provide a holistic solution, and what are the other partners that American Rivers can work with to make certain that we put the river on the very best trajectory for improvement. One of the other things that John mentioned was biodiversity, and we have a lot of opportunity with existing resources to focus on some of the charismatic megafauna in the Ohio Basin that really address the river quality itself. Freshwater mussels that can provide ecosystem services in terms of natural filtration. Fish species that are sought after by anglers and can bring local economic improvements to a community. Some of those are eastern brook trout, and some of our river resident species like walleye and muskie, sauger, drum that are quite popular with sportsmen. But another important thing is that so many of our communities have been disconnected from their waterway, and there may be large dams, and of course there are on the Ohio River, that are really critical for the nation's economy in terms of moving goods. But when we look at the impact of some of those large dams, the result is that people that can't spend 6 figures on a recreational boat really don't have access to the river. And so that's one of the issues that, while it doesn't focus specifically on hydrology, it is an issue that we can solve as we try to deal with some of these other opportunities for multiple benefits. And I'm going to stop there because I know that there are other speakers that can add extra to this. And then if you have questions, we can dive a little deeper.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Debbie, how about you, and then Sally?
Sure, thanks. This has been a very interesting process, to say the least, with all of these brilliant folks working together in particular areas of expertise. For the Climate Change Committee, which has been co-led by Jana Heisler-White from Battelle, we've really worked to think about how do we talk about the impacts of climate change on all of these other topic areas within the plan overall, without being at risk of being repetitive or stating things slightly differently. So it's been an interesting challenge to engage with, and I think we've found some good approaches to consider for that. So to begin, like if you look at the IPCC's 6th assessment report and look at the widespread consensus of what we may expect to see in our region, like Eastern North America and Central Appalachia, much of which is within the Ohio River Basin, is a region that will have somewhat more moderate temperature changes than many other parts of the world, and we will still have precipitation. It is going to be coming increasingly in these very large storm events that have been challenging to manage. And we've seen this in recent years with the tragic flooding that occurred in Eastern Tennessee in 2021, in Eastern Kentucky in 2022. So we know that these challenges are going to continue to happen, and we need to be prepared for that. But this will still be a region where we can grow food, and where the potential for our forested land to help be a climate mitigating strategy exists. The work that can be done with respect to good landscape management to slow down the flow of water and promote infiltration so that we maintain and build soil, which is an incredibly important carbon sink. Like all of these things are important considerations, and we anticipate, we're already seeing, in fact, in-migration of people who are climate refugees from areas of the country that are more intensely impacted already by storms and fires and things like that. So we know that people are moving here, which could put pressure in terms of conflict for land use and the potential for region-wide gentrification. And we also know that there will be increasing demand for these water resources. So how do we integrate all of this with smart management of the tremendous freshwater resources that will continue to be available here? How do we manage that in a way that reduces the potential for human suffering and builds on our, an ability to slow water down, to hold water and get it to where it is needed. So these larger trends have really informed the discussion of the committee. Because that is so complex, we have within the committee taken an approach to considering like a co-benefits model, so that when we're looking at landscape management practices, which things help to address more than one of these issues. If we're concerned about nutrient runoff and hydrology and species and habitat, what are the things that will also help as a mitigation or a resilience strategy in the climate scenarios that are here and coming? And also, how does that information get shared with communities? So there are lots of local jurisdictions that make land management decisions regularly, whether they are looking at gray infrastructure or green infrastructure. How do we help local officials and local land managers access the data and learn about best practices so that infrastructure is being scaled appropriately and these co-benefit models are integrated in the day-to-day work of our local communities that are making these decisions, particularly when there's a lot of money flowing for infrastructure right now through the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. So big questions. We therefore, we also didn't try to say all the things that should happen for climate mitigation and adaptation and resilience. We tried to focus on the things that are directly connected to Ohio River restoration and this plan overall, and zeroed in on some of those key questions related to information flow and availability and accessibility. So our goals so far are focused around education and knowledge sharing to promote widespread adoption of best practices, infrastructure planning and development that is informed by data, including looking at the social networks and kind of the human capital networks on how those things play out on the ground, planning for sustainable use of water resources, knowing that there is the potential for greater conflict about the need for fresh water as things progress, and restoration efforts that enhance ecosystem structure, function, and services tied in with the climate modeling. So some of the things that John talked about are an excellent example. How do we sort through the co-benefits that are possible? And then in order to really try to avoid making the document too dense and too cross-referenced, we also developed a structure to incorporate some information within each of the other chapters. So we've been trying to provide some structure for that, and we've got some really good beginnings of that work. I'll use habitat and species as an example. So within habitat and species, we look at questions about what are the ways that climate change is expected to impact this sector, and what are some of the management strategies that folks should be considering, and where are some reliable sources of data that people may go for more, to be included as a sidebar in each of those other chapters. So with habitat and species, what's been identified as a climate impact is increased temperatures and CO2 levels and changed precipitation patterns will affect aquatic habitats and species in several ways. So looking at what is going to change in that, and then talking to folks about potential degradation in water quality, changes in water temperature, the increased turbidity, and linking people to information about practices that are going to help slow down soil erosion, things that help cool water in these stream channels. we're not trying to cover all the things. We're mainly trying to suggest that investments made in a particular area, consider that co-benefits model. We also embrace the RAD model that is being used by the Park Service and USGS. I think it's USGS. That creates a way to assess land management decisions based on whether we need to resist, adapt, or direct. So do we implement practices to try to fight the thing that is happening, which is a legit response in some cases, but might be a losing battle? Like, where do we need to just accept that this change has occurred and then make whatever adaptations we need to do as well as we can with the new reality? And where can we try to direct the trajectory that is in place? So really, a lot of our work has been trying to promote synthesis and data sharing and best practices in all of these things in recognition of how it is expected to be affected by climate change. So I'll stop there. And Sally has been working on environmental justice issues related to who are the folks who are most severely and soonest impacted by all of these.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Debbie. And again, thank you, Jordan. Like climate change, of course, environmental justice and tribal issues are overarching issues in the plan, right? So they're very akin to one another. Jordan and I have been working with an exemplary group of volunteers to help us and inform us so that we can formulate these chapters on these particular issues. And kind of where we are with that is we were going to have one chapter that was environmental justice and tribal issues. And right away, we were educated that we should not mix the two. So they're actually going to come out as two different narratives within the plan. So we're going to separate them to really acknowledge the sovereign role, the sovereignty of the tribes in the basin, and also that those issues are indeed in a different bin, so to speak, as we begin to put the plan together. We have tried over the last couple of years to really, first and foremost, raise awareness of these issues in the basin. That said, it's a very complex and large basin. And immediately one of the, and it's still a big issue in the preparation of the chapter, the issue of data. How do we aggregate the data? How do we know where all of these environmental justice communities are? Where are they in the basin? And many of the tools that we use more traditionally, like EJ Screen, that's EPA tool, the granularity is always an issue. How granular can we get the data? So I think as we look to the chapter and as we begin to articulate some of the needs and some of the areas that really require investment is certainly in trying to amass, real, meaningful, and accurate maps and data overall on what are these impacts in these communities. And again, when we're talking about environmental justice, it's certainly poor communities, communities of color. So it's a broad definition. It's not just zeroing in on communities of color. And what we're trying to do is we are trying to really develop a set of recommendations that will assure a real and meaningful role in the restoration process. We think that communication is a tremendously important aspect of this, because many of these communities, they don't have the same communication tools that others have. So to me, investing in making sure that we have the right kind of construct for effective communication is going to be critical. The other one to me that is always just really a centerpiece here is the need for capacity building in these communities. Many of these communities are not organized. They're rural. They're not even in any way organized where they have a functioning structure. So I think that one of the great opportunities here is to bring about not only enhanced and robust communication infrastructure, but actual capacity building for the organizations that will carry out many of these functions. Like others have said, flooding is a big issue for these communities, I would say, on the whole. Pollution prevention, many of these communities have been impacted by pollution sources for many years. And how do we stop that from happening? How do we make these solutions also affordable? And other important aspects are around education and access to education, so that we can build the workforce that will help us carry out many of the projects that are contemplated by the plan overall. Let me stop there because I know we're running short on time. And just again, thanks everyone for listening.
Well, thank you, Sally, Debbie, Lisa, and John. We're going to go into some Q&A and some discussion. I want to remind folks, one question came up. I want to reiterate, I might have glossed over the timeline we're talking about. As I mentioned, there are 9 committees who are diligently doing work as we're holding listening sessions. Our goal is to get a draft out in mid to late June. The goal is to wrap this process up and get a final plan by the end of the year. So all the work you're hearing about, there's an immediacy to it. And so this is fortuitous timing to give an update. So thanks for tuning in. With that, I want to open it up to questions. We did have a question come in even prior to the webinar. So we'll start with that. And the question was, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, what policies are we pushing and supporting at the state level? Excellent question. I want to reiterate that the planning process we're doing is to get federal funding and federal policy solutions for this. But a core principle is that we want to align, like we've heard, I think Debbie talked about local land decisions. There's a state role. We want to align the local, state, and federal priorities to make sure that we're all going in the same direction, and that, for instance, federal funding won't be undermined by decision making at a lower level, or in the more optimistic view, we have state and local actions that are only supporting what the federal government is doing. And I think a concrete example of that is we have a new rule coming out that I think goes into effect in March that protects streams and wetlands. The EPA and Army Corps are putting forward some new guidance to protect streams and wetlands. And while the federal government is doing this, what we don't want to see are rollbacks on protections at the state level. So I think when Sally mentioned pollution prevention, one way that state and federal policies can be aligned is to make sure we're all protecting the waters and the land, especially what's happening on land impacts the water, so that we're all going the same direction. So excellent question. Other questions, and you can put it in the chat or come off mute. And if not, I can toss a few to our panelists here. Other questions? I'll throw one out to our panelists, and I have my thoughts as well. But on the chart I showed, a lot of the federal money for ecosystem restoration are more lakes or our coasts. They're not so much river systems. And a few folks have touched on maybe some of the challenges, but do we want to talk about what some of the challenges are? And I would say also maybe opportunities for, like, when you talk about restoration, a river system, like how that's differentiated with some of the challenges. Do I want to take that?
I can jump in since we are practitioners in some ways. I think that the kind of fluctuations in funding that's available for the work that happens upstream can be really challenging. So the abandoned mine land funding, which can address the AMD inflows into these streams and other restoration practices, has been dependent on the health of the trust fund that was created by the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act. There's a lot more money there now in this administration, and kind of with the AMLR program looking at restoration projects that have connections to economic development. So this is a time when a lot more can get done, but when things, when times get lean, programs get smaller, and then if there's a huge inflow of money all at once, it can be challenging to stand up capacity to get money to the ground and do the work. There also can be thinking about the role of states, like differences in how programs are implemented from state to state. So we know that in some states, agroforestry practices such as multifunction riparian corridors or alley cropping can qualify for subsidy programs like EQIP and Conservation Reservation Program. In other states, those practices are not as widely known by the county level technical service providers. And so employing some of those multi-benefit practices can be more possible in some places than in other places.
Thank you, Debbie.
I'll also add that, I think, like you mentioned, Jordan, is that it's not just, one surrounding area that drains to some, lake or bay. It's things that are happening high up in the headwaters that are then affecting, a little bit farther downstream, which affects a little bit farther downstream, and things aggregate. And so, a lot of people might focus on, just the main stem Ohio, but I think as Lisa mentions a lot too, is that, the Ohio River Basin is also not just the main stem, but also the major tributaries and all small in the many more small streams. And so in getting some of those improvements realized farther downstream, it's really taking a harder look and a larger investment at things that are happening farther upstream in those small channels that can then help propagate better changes farther downstream. And I think that's one of the things and challenges of this work is what we're trying to do is focus on the small scale changes that can happen, that can propagate to the big scale changes, not just the big scale changes alone.
Thanks, John. I would agree. I would also say one thing we didn't talk a lot about, we could talk for hours, is that the main stem of the Ohio River, obviously highly managed system with the locks and dams and the navigation charge. I would say that it's maybe fodder for another day, but the U.S. Army Corps is doing some exciting investigation into how to more environmentally and sustainably manage flows in the main stem of the river that would both allow for navigation, but also expose habitat and allow for fish and birds and other wildlife to take advantage of that. I see a question coming in from Laura. Do we know what projects will be funded in the watershed through the new infrastructure monies, since that'll happen after we start this process? So excellent question. I will say from the top level, we do have a lot of funding coming in from both the climate bill that passed and the bipartisan infrastructure law that passed. Those are both, I think, 4 or 5 year appropriations, but we'll see a lot of money. I think there's guidance on how those will be spent, but I know that from my perch, and I don't do a lot of hands-on implementing, but I know that there's a lot of money going out the door for a lot of good work, and maybe some colleagues on the call could answer that, because I know the first year it's going to be hard to get all that money out the door. It's a lot of money coming at once. But does anyone want to take a shot at that? I'm going to ask you some other questions as well.
Sure, this is Lisa. So, yeah, we're directly involved in, well, First American Rivers was directly involved in helping to craft some of this legislation and make certain that dam removals was an eligible activity, recognizing the benefits. So I had some colleagues at American Rivers that worked really hard with a lot of other partners to make certain that that these kinds of projects were something that were valuable, and the value was well understood, and it was written into the Infrastructure Act that money could be spent to restore habitat and to improve ecosystem service benefits and all the other things that we get from rivers that we've talked about, and the Ohio River as well. At this point, there's been a really organized process working through U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and other federal agencies that have a share of the infrastructure funds to identify the best projects that will spend the money in a most efficient way and return benefits, and do it within the time frame that's available. And so we are really coordinating closely with people with organizations that have projects to make certain that we put in the very best applications that are going to be the most competitive. And so that's been a fairly rigorous planning project that's been going on now since about August of last year. So I am uncertain as the time frame of decision making with the current round. I can say that previous rounds of funds seemed to be dedicated on projects that were kind of sitting on hold, large projects that needed resources that weren't available through some of the traditional sources at that time. And I think that what we're seeing is some really good projects rise to the top that have some great opportunity to make transformative changes on the ground in terms of river health and all of the benefits that we're looking to provide.
I want to jump in and add just one little piece. I think a lot of local communities or practitioners are challenged by the process and the speed for a lot of these, because we're all needing to scale up at a time when there are significant workforce impacts happening due to the Great Resignation and all of these things. So it is complicated trying to organize some of these big proposals, and some states are probably better positioned to receive some of the project money. So there's significant money in the Inflation Reduction Act, the climate bill, for addressing legacy pollution. And in our region, there are a lot of orphaned and abandoned oil and gas wells that are off-gassing methane, which is, that's just a critically important thing to do as far as capping those properly. Is an important thing for climate mitigation and for reducing, some sources of pollution that could flow ultimately into the Ohio River. But the state's contracting process needs work if we're going to be able to get that money deployed. There are provisions in there about Davis-Bacon applying, and the state's contracting process historically has made it very challenging for that to be attractive work for organized labor. So it's just going to be a process to work through any possible policy choke points for getting the money to the ground to do this really important work.
Thank you, Debbie. I see a few more questions, but I also see we have about a minute and a half. I want to quickly address how do we promote this, the beneficial uses through people who use Ohio for commerce, i.e. heavy industry, barge, et cetera. I will say that as part of the Ohio River Basin Alliance, they have a strategic plan that has 6 goals. One is, for lack of a better term, economic development, and that work group is represented with Marty Heddle, who heads it. He's with the barge industry. So I think we're working hand in hand with other sectors, including business. And I think I will just say a lesson learned from other ecosystem restoration efforts is if we can go arm in arm with the chambers of commerce and local community development corporations and other partners, the recreation industry. I see the Ohio River Ways on Brewster Roads. Like, I think there are a lot of businesses from recreation to barge to everything that will support a healthier, more sustainable and vibrant Ohio River Basin, both the main stem and its tributaries. With that, I will answer these other questions via email in the next day or two, but I want to respect time. We have 1 more minute. I'm putting my email in the chat. If you have any questions, please follow up with me. I know we send out notes or a follow-up with a recording link. If you have any questions, please let me know or any of the panelists. I want to thank all the organizers for coming today. Again, mark your calendar for next month when I have a great youth program. I think it's March 8th actually. So thanks for joining. It's 1 o'clock. It's the witching hour. Thanks for tuning in. If you want to get involved, please email me and please support Ohio River Restoration. We're all going to benefit from it. Thanks and have a great day.